So thanks very much indeed for inviting me. So what I wanted to do was just spend about half an hour telling you about some of the amazing things that the brain can do in terms of computation and what we know about how it performs those computations and how understanding the computations that the brain performs can help us build better artificial intelligence systems. And I'm happy to discuss at the end. Right, so this is a mold of a real human brain. And you can see it doesn't look very large, and it doesn't weigh very much. But contained within your brain is basically all the information that makes you, all your hopes, desires, plans for the future. Everything is encoded in some way in your brain. And after thousands of years of studying it, we still really have very little understanding of precisely how that information is encoded and how information is processed in your brain in order to understand the world around you, make plans for the future, and so on. But I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things we do know. So first of all, I want to illustrate what a powerful computer your brain is. And for that, I'm going to pick on somebody in the audience. How about you with the hat, sir? What's your name? Mitchell, catch. Well done, thank you, Mitchell. So let's just discuss what happened in Mitchell's brain here. Let me just make, if anybody's heard this before, you haven't heard the whole talk. You might have heard this before, but you haven't heard the whole talk. Okay, let's just discuss what happened in Mitchell's brain then. So firstly, he was able to split up this continuous stream of sounds coming out of my mouth into individual words. Now that in itself is a very difficult problem. If you've interacted with speech understanding systems, you know that's still a challenging problem. So if you look at the waveform on an oscilloscope, it's just a continual stream, right? It's not like from the oscilloscope you can see where the word boundaries are. I'm not talking like this. And yet, through Mitchell's vast experience with the English language, he was able to apparently effortlessly split that stream up into individual words. He was then able to understand what all those words meant and what my intention from using those words was. And as we'll see later, that in itself is a very difficult problem. Even after you've sorted out the speech recognition problem, you then have to figure out the language understanding problem. He then had to decide how to catch this object, right? So this object was just coming straight towards him, looming in his visual field, right? Very little information about the trajectory of that object. And yet, he was able to make very, very precise predictions about where the object would be, what time it would be there. He then had to send commands to his muscles to move his hands to an appropriate location to catch that object, right? Now, that's what's mathematically called an ill-posed problem, meaning there's infinitely many ways to do that. So to move my hand from here to here, I could do that, or I could do that, or I could do that. There's infinitely many solutions. And yet Mitchell, picked one. We don't know how he picked one, but he picked one which got his hands in the right place at the right time. Now, while that object was in the air, he then made a number of inferences about the properties of that object. For instance, its mass. So he sort of guessed roughly how much it would weigh. If I'd given him the idea it was a very, very heavy object, he would have positioned his hand slightly differently to catch a very heavy object. If I'd given him the impression it was a very slippery object, perhaps if I just pulled it out of, just been smearing with Vaseline and then threw it to him, then he positioned his hands differently again to catch a very slippery object. So all that computation happened within Mitchell's brain within about half a second. And did it feel like hard work? Did it feel like hard work? No, right, because those are the kind of problems your brain has evolved to solve. They have not evolved to do university courses, right? It's evolved to survive in the real world. And so it's very easy to underestimate the computational power of your brain, because the problems it solves you kind of take for granted because they're so easy for you. It's only when you start trying to program computers to solve those problems that you get an appreciation for just how difficult some of those problems are. So if you could toss it back to me. Thank you very much. Let's have a big round of applause for Mitchell. Thank you. So there's a true story about when, back in the 1960s at MIT in Boston, professor thought, we've got some good computers now. I know, let's solve computer vision. Let's write a computer program so we can show the computer a visual scene, and it will tell us what's in the visual scene. We'll give this to a summer student, right? 3 months should be enough, right? So several decades later, and we're still working on this problem, right? These are very, very difficult problems. Okay, so those are some of the things the brain does. So how does it do them? Well, the basic computational elements of the brain are neurons, and the way neurons communicate with each other is through small pulses of electrical activity, often called spikes. So this is just a schematic showing like this is a representation of a little pulse of activity traveling from one neuron to another neuron. So when it reaches another neuron, it passes through what's called a synapse, and a synapse is a little chemical gate which tells the receiving neuron how much to change in response to this signal. Because these signals are all the same size. They're just like a dot in Morse code. There's nothing, there's nothing about the size of the signal which conveys information. It's just the fact you have a signal or not and the precise timing of that signal. But it's the synapse that scales that signal for the receiving neuron. And so if you could, listen to, if you turn those electrical signals into sounds and listen to what's going on in your brain, there's lots and lots of these little blips of activity going on. Beep, 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 beep. But you've got like of the order of 10 to the 11 neurons, and each one on average might be firing at least once a second. So there's an awful lot of activity going on in there. And that's how your brain is computing. I mean, it's dark and quiet in there. It's not like you have there's a visual scene in there. The visual scene is just formed up of these dots and dashes. So those are the basic computational units. But there's something about this picture, I mean, just a schematic, but there's something about it which is just fundamentally misleading about what's actually in your head. Can anybody suggest what that might be?
Space.
The space, right. Who said that? Thank you. So it looks from this picture like your brain's empty space. Most of your brain is empty space, and that may be true for me, but I think for most people it's probably not true. And just recently, people have actually reconstructed small regions of the, very small regions of the brain to see exactly what's in there. And so here's an example from the recent work of Jeff Lichtman and colleagues at Harvard. So this was a project that took years and cost millions of dollars. And this is a very small fraction of the brain, so a smaller region than we were just looking at. Or it's certainly not bigger. And by fancy microscopy techniques, they completely reconstructed everything in this very small volume of brain. And so here's a movie of what is in this very small volume of brain. So this is what it really looks like in your brain. Obviously, things are not different colors. They just color them in for purposes of visualization. And so here's all the different elements. So we've got nerve fibers, and we've got cell bodies, and we've got lots of other cells, which they'll talk about in a moment. So you can see, you can already start to see that at the cutting edge of neuroscience, there's lots of interesting computer science problems, not least to produce nice graphics like this, right, to understand at least what's in the brain. And so here's it split into the nerve fibers, the supporting cells, and then these are split up into other components. So all that was packed in just a tiny, tiny region of your brain, and you've got to multiply that by a factor of about 10 to the 11. So there's a huge amount of stuff in there. So one of the other exciting things about modern neuroscience is that we now have tools to visualize the activity of neurons. So for a long time, you've been able to put a human in a magnetic resonance imaging scanner and detect brain activity on the scale of about 1 millimeter. But that's averaging over many, many tens of thousands of neurons. Now we have biological tools which allow us to visualize activity at the single neuron level, not in humans, but in animal models. And one animal model that's used a lot for this is the zebrafish. And so this is a picture of the head of a baby zebrafish. We like baby zebrafish because they're very easy to work with and they're transparent. And that means we can label the neurons such that they glow when they're active. And we can directly visualize the activity of more or less the whole brain just by putting it under a microscope and look at these glowing neurons. And so here's some data from our lab. And here, so this is what you see, this is a fluorescence image of the neurons in one plane of the zebrafish brain. So each I knew I was going to do that. So, you know what, I'm just going to take that out. So each little dot is an individual neuron, and the zebrafish is just sitting there in a dish. We're looking at the activity of the neurons in the brain, and it's not doing anything. This is just spontaneous activity. And this movie is speeded up a bit, but you can see there's lots and lots of activity in the brain. So even when you're not doing anything, there's still lots and lots of activity. So this is a couple of people in the lab who've contributed to this work are Jan Malta and Lilak Avitan, who are sitting up the back there. And so there's lots of very interesting problems you can try and analyze using this kind of recording technology. So you can try and think about how the patterns of activity are representing information about the world. And one of the things we've been looking at is how, you know, what spontaneous activity is doing and how it develops. Now, one of the interesting mathematical problems is how to extract structure from these complicated patterns of activity. And so, working in my lab, we have people with backgrounds in experimental biology, but we also have people like Jan and Lilak who have backgrounds in computer science and mathematics and physics. And we use those kind of tools in order to extract statistical information. So here's just I'm not going to explain what this is, but essentially here's one of the tools we're currently using to extract information. So this is from a recent paper that was proposed to analyze the structure in communities of social networks, like on Facebook and so on. And here we're using it to analyze the structure in the patterns of firing of neurons. And so a background in computer science and mathematics can be incredibly important for solving difficult problems to analyze current neuroscience data. Okay, so that's a little bit about how the brain computes. We have these neurons that are all firing to these complicated patterns. Let's go back now to thinking about the kind of computations it does. So here's a movie which... So I have to show it. So unfortunately, HDMI doesn't allow me to turn off the sound. So this is a movie produced by a Japanese group where you see this beautiful illusion that if you look at this image from one perspective, you see what looks like a very regular garage roof, but in fact that's not what's actually there. And this is just one very nice representation of the fact that for every visual scene, every pattern of objects, every pattern of activity on your eye, reaching your eye, there's an infinite number of possible states of the world which have that, which could be consistent with that interpretation. And so here's an explanation of why you tend to see, okay, so I can turn the sound back up now. Why you tend to see that particular, why you like to see it as a nice clean edge like that, because your experience in the world tells you that that's a statistical regularity that it's a property of many things in the real world. They tend not to look like the actual shape of the object. And so there's an ambiguity there, and you come down on the side of something which makes sense in the context of your experience. So another way to put that is that basically the world is very ambiguous and noisy, and for every pattern on your eye, say this is the pattern of lines falling on your retina, there's an infinite number of states of the world which are consistent with that pattern. So, you know, how do you solve these problems? And the same with language, right? As we'll see, there's many ways in which language is ambiguous, but you can mess it up and you still have no problem understanding it. So one way to put this is that the brain is very good at solving mathematical problems like this, right? So this is an ill-posed problem. There's an infinite number of solutions. But those are the problems which you encounter in the world all the time. So right now, you are solving lots of ill-posed problems. What that means is your brain is deciding on a solution when there's an infinite number of possible solutions. And it's using some kind of rules to decide what's the most likely solution. We'll come back in a moment to what those rules might be. And it's clearly doing that very effectively. So let's just talk a little bit more about language. So it's, again, understanding language is something you do effortlessly, and it's hard to appreciate quite how difficult it is. And so one of the problems with language is called ambiguous reference. So here we have a very simple sentence, and there's a reference in the sentence, it. So it refers back to something earlier, but the question is, what does it refer back to? Well, it could refer back to the company, the money, or UQ, right? So here, most people would agree that it is associated with the company. That's most likely interpretation, right? That's what sort of makes sense in the context of this sentence. But say we change the end of the sentence. Now, perhaps it seems more likely that it refers back to UQ, right? And we can easily make the it seem likely to refer to the money, right? So how did you decide for each of these sentences, with almost the same sentence, yet the it refers to something different, right? So, I mean, imagine trying to get a computer to understand that sentence. The computer has to decide what the it refers to. And in order to make that decision, you're drawing on, a very deep understanding of the nature of the world, right? About what kinds of objects tend to have what kinds of properties. And you're doing that continuously and effortlessly. So a very popular idea in neuroscience, or at least computational neuroscience, is that perception is statistical inference. That the way you perceive the world is in terms you're constantly making statistical inferences, and a popular idea is this is based on Bayes' theorem. Who's come across Bayes' theorem before? A few of you, right? So I won't go through the details, but essentially it's a way of telling you how to decide which of many possibilities is most likely, given your prior assumptions about the world. So the idea is, through evolution and then through your own experience, you're developing assumptions that you're developing a statistical model of what the world is like, and you're using that to help you interpret all this noisy and ambiguous information that's constantly coming in. So just like that garage roof example, you have a prior belief of what kinds of patterns of lines you tend to see in the world. So we said that neurons compute using these spikes which pass between them. So what a spiking neuron's got to do with Bayesian inference? Well, people are working on that. So here's an example of a recent paper from a computational neuroscientist called Sophie Deneve in Paris. And so people are working on theories. So this is a very recent paper. People are working on theories for how these, the hardware we know is present in the brain might be able to implement these kinds of computational algorithms. And there's kind of two approaches to that, one of which is you just simulate these algorithms on a standard digital computer, and you can get a lot of insight from doing that, help you understand whether these algorithms work or not. But there's another class of people who are doing what's called neuromorphic computing, which is where you try to implement the algorithms you think are actually going on in the brain in hardware which is actually much more like the hardware of the brain, neuron-like elements. And one of the motivations for doing that is that digital computers are pathetic in terms of power consumption, right? So all the computation that went on in Mitchell's brain when he caught the brain was far less than your laptop is using on standby power, right? And so to scale up a computer to the computational power of the brain would use megawatts worth of electricity. So clearly your brain is being far more efficient. It's got an amazing compute-to-energy ratio. And so other people are working on how you can build physical devices which have that, have a better ratio. Something, we haven't got anywhere close to a brain-like ratio, but at least something closer. Okay, so let's talk a bit about brain-inspired artificial intelligence. So what neuroscientists currently believe is that the way you learn, the way you develop like your statistical model of the world, the way you remember what you ate for dinner last night, is by changing the strengths of these synapses between neurons, so changing the strengths of connections. So that idea has been around for a long time, and it's inspired the field of artificial neural networks. So by neural networks, we mean groups of computational units which are a bit like neurons, and they have weighted connections between them. And the basic problem is to figure out rules for changing the strengths of those connections so that this network can learn stuff about the world. And who's heard of deep learning? Okay, so deep learning is very fashionable at the moment. It's important to realize a couple of things. So firstly, the basic ideas behind deep learning have been around for many decades. But there's been a very dramatic breakthrough in the past few years, past 5 years or so, in terms of some tricks for speeding up the algorithms combined with some really nice new hardware, which is very good, very efficient for these kinds of computations, which means that finally we're able to see the payoff from the work that people did in the 70s and 80s on developing the basic mathematical ideas behind these learning algorithms. So the way these algorithms work is that they're inspired by the basic hierarchy of processing that you see in the brain. So, for instance, in the visual system, information comes in through the eye and is passed through a number of different layers of processing, different stages in a hierarchy. And so, roughly speaking, you can model that as a series of layers of artificial neurons. So each neuron sees a few neurons in the layer below. And you apply inputs to the input layer, and in what's called supervised learning, which is basically what deep learning is about, you present a series of examples and you present an input and you tell it what the output is supposed to be. So, for instance, you might present a picture of a dog and say, I want you to understand that that's a dog. And you show it lots and lots of examples like that. And you show examples of cats and so on. And so you show lots of different images. You tell it what that image is. And given enough data, and this is the other important thing, that in the past few years, a lot of data has become available via the internet. Given enough data, deep learning systems can do an amazing job in pattern recognition, far exceeding any other techniques that have been developed based on more sort of classical techniques for image understanding. So this is, it may be hard to appreciate from your perspective, but the past 5 years have just seen a complete revolution in this, right? So, 5 years ago, these image understanding competitions were being won by, very sort of handcrafted techniques using a lot of classical image processing algorithms, and then people presented, these deep learning approaches, and within that time, deep learning has just completely taken over. Essentially, nobody even bothers entering one of these competitions anymore unless they've got some new wrinkle on a deep learning network. So here's some examples of those successes over the past few years, and I'm going to talk more about this one in a moment. And as you probably know, all big technology companies now are making a significant investment in this neural network technology inspired by understanding how brains work. And so here's some example of some of the startup companies, and there's clearly a career just in terms of coming up with names for these kinds of companies, right? They're like Synapsify and Hyperverge and MetaMind, and it's really cool. And so clearly people think there's a lot of money to be made out of deep learning. And these companies are hiring people with backgrounds in computational neuroscience. They think that people who know something about how the brain works are going to be useful in terms of developing new learning algorithms. Okay, so that's deep learning. But that's basically supervised learning. You present examples and you tell it exactly what that example is supposed to be. Now, that's not like learning in the real world, right? The way you learn things is mostly people don't tell you what the correct answer was supposed to be. You just go through and you find whether you got a reward for that decision or not. So in a very simplified case, we might imagine a rat going into a maze, and it explores that maze and discovers different numbers of food pellets in different places. And now we have what's called reinforcement learning. So this started with Pavlov, and the idea is how do you develop expectations about reward, and how do you decide how to optimize your decisions to maximize that reward. So People have been studying this in psychology for a long time, and starting in the 70s, people started developing mathematical models of that. And this is the general it's given the general name of reinforcement learning. So the idea is you perform some actions and you get some reinforcement, and you have to decide how that reward should be attributed to this combination of actions you took. So there are now some very sophisticated mathematical algorithms for doing that. This is just an example of an equation from something called Q-learning, which we'll say a bit more about in a moment. And so basically people developed mathematical models for how animals might be, so inspired by the animal learning literature, inspired mathematical models for how animals might be solving this problem. And this now has turned out to be immensely powerful in terms of solving practical problems as well. And in fact, just a week or so ago, the so-called Brain Prize, which is a major prize for neuroscience research, was awarded for solving the problem of understanding how the brain deals with reward signals. And one of the three people who won that prize was a guy called Peter Dayan at University College in London, who actually he was one of the pioneers of the mathematical theory of reinforcement learning. So his background was in mathematics, and by studying the animal behavioral literature, he developed mathematical rules which are now used in a wide variety of practical systems for solving this problem of learning from rewards. So I want to wrap up in the next few slides by just showing you some examples of the power of reinforcement and deep learning in practical applications. So has anybody come across Google DeepMind? So they're a company based in London. They were started by a former postdoc of Peter Dayan. So a guy who was studying computational neuroscience, and then he thought he could develop better artificial intelligence. He started this company. That company was then bought by Google for about $500 million. And they've been publishing some papers which demonstrate the power of their algorithms. So this is one of their classic papers from 2015. So what they did was they trained a deep reinforcement network to play a variety of Atari video games, right, including Space Invaders. Now, this is not because anybody is particularly interested in being able to get a computer to play video games. I mean, there's enough people who want to play video games, right? This is not you don't need to replace those people. But the attraction of it is a nice constrained domain where you have a screen of information and you have some very clear reward signal, which is your score. And you want to try and develop a system which can, with complete generality, learn the rules of the game and learn optimal strategies for that game, only based on giving it lots and lots of experience with the game. So you want to get away from this idea that you have to teach the network what to do. You want the network to teach itself. So the input is just the screen, and here's a schematic of their network. So you have a series of layers, and the output is just a decision to where to move your cannon and whether to fire or not. And so after lots and lots of training with this game, with no human intervention apart from the rules of the learning algorithm, no direct intervention in terms of telling it anything about the game, here's the computer having learned to play this game. And here is it. Let's skip ahead. So the level of performance the computer achieved with this game far exceeded the level of performance of any human on this game. And they were able to do this with a number of different games. So if you train you take a new network and you train it on a different game, you can get very good performance with a different game. So here we've got a fairly general sort of intelligence learning algorithm that you can apply to lots of different problems. The next success of Google DeepMind was applying a similar kind of network to the game of Go. So anybody know this example? This was from about a year ago now. So what they did was they basically took a similar network. First of all, they trained it on some human games, and then they let the network play against itself. And by playing against itself, it got far more experience than a human can amass in a lifetime of Go playing. And then they challenged the world Go champion, Lee Sedol, to a match. And let me just show you a little example of what happens. I'm going to show you a small movie of some commentators discussing in the middle of one of the games. So these are expert human Go players discussing how things are going between Lisa Doll and the computer.
And so that's something you look for. And it changes the value of the area when you have a strong group like this, because black doesn't have any point to approach it because it's so strong.
And this is what Thorad from the Google team was talking about. Is this kind of evaluation, value?
That's a very surprising move.
I thought it was a mistake.
So here, the program came up with a move which the humans were completely stunned by. It didn't seem to make any sense as far as they were concerned, right? So the computer went on to win that game, and it went on to win the whole match, 4-1. And so this is a very clear example where the artificial intelligence has moved beyond a point, moved way beyond human expertise, and moved beyond the point where the humans can even understand what kind of long-term strategies it's using. So this was the famous Move 37, and it's quite possible that in 50 years' time, Move 37 will go down as the moment when the computers took over. So it starts with a game of Go, and it ends with something else. But don't worry, because along the way, there's going to be lots of cool stuff like self-driving cars, right? So we'll all be happy. Okay, so this is my last slide. So what I've tried to show you is that there are very strong links between understanding how computation occurs in the brain, trying to mathematically analyze, and trying to develop mathematical models of that, and artificial intelligence. And there's two-way links between all of those things. So whether you're studying biology, computer science, or mathematics, there are some very, very important problems in neuroscience to solve. We're really only starting to scratch the surface here. So thanks very much for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Right, so evolutionary algorithms are a way of optimizing the parameters of a network to perform some task. But they work very differently in that basically you're just searching a parameter space looking for some optimum parameters. But in reinforcement learning, you're actually trying to sort of build a model of optimal actions. And so it's looking forward in time through a series of actions, and at least one form of reinforcement learning. And so that's not a problem which, as far as I'm aware of, evolutionary algorithms being applied to. Right. So, I mean, that's a very good good question, and it comes down to this philosophical issue of once if you've got through machine learning you develop something which has very good performance, but you don't necessarily understand precisely the rules it's following. And I mean, this comes down to sort of an ethical issue as well, in terms of somebody gets run over by a self-driving car, who's to blame. And so, I mean, I don't think there's a good answer to that. I mean, there are, a big area of research within deep learning is trying to understand why these networks do what they do, trying to understand the internal representations and that, trying to understand why they perform so well. I mean, it reminds me that I've heard that one of the issues with self-driving cars is that when humans see a yellow light, they speed up, and when self-driving cars see a yellow light, they slow down, and this causes accidents, right? So, you have to. It's probably in the end, it's going to be some hybrid of some parts which are designed by humans and other parts which are allowed to learn based on experience. Well, I think one of the biggest issues is power consumption. So, you can make things. I mean, using conventional digital technology, you can make things very small. That's not really the problem. The problem is, how much computing you can get out of each watt of each joule of energy, and so the brain seems to have solutions to that, which we haven't quite cracked yet. I mean, part of it is the massive parallelism of the brain. I mean, your laptop is essentially, might have 8 cores, but it's still, each one's running serially. whereas the brain is a massively parallel machine. I mean, so like to interpret a visual, like in Mitchell's brain, there were, only, you probably count on the fingers of one hand the number of sort of distinct stages of processing there were to implement, the algorithms. But the thing is, each stage involved many, many neurons working in parallel. Yes, so the input was the screen and the game score. But you see, what was really cool was that they didn't give it an abstract representation of the world. They gave it the actual pixels, just the pixels on the screen. So it had to solve all these low-level image processing problems before it could even start the problem of trying to take this abstract representation of where the spaceships are and turn that into a useful action. Right, so a paper just appeared today in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It doesn't have lots of cool pictures like the other papers I showed you, so that's why I didn't talk about it. But this is the latest paper from DeepMind, and they partly trying to address this question of how you so their network, you could train it on Space Invaders and it would do really well, and you could train it on another game and it would do really well, but you can't train it on both of them and do well on both of them. What they've done in this new paper is come up with a revision of that algorithm where you can train it, you can kind of interleave training on lots of different games, and it will maintain its performance. It will gradually develop good performance on several different games simultaneously. And I haven't read the paper yet, I've been busy today, but I'm going to read it tonight. There's various tricks in terms of trying to preserve some of the... So finding out which of the connections in the network are particularly important for playing one kind of game and trying to preserve those rather than allowing those weights to be overwritten in the next game. So this is a step forward, but it doesn't solve the general problem of, which humans are very good at, of being able to generalize their experience from one game. So this is just about not letting one new experience interfere with another experience. But what humans are able to do is use your some of the tricks you've learned playing one kind of game to help you play another kind of game, abstracting some of the higher level rules, which there may be very different motor commands involved, but some of the higher level sort of strategic rules may carry over, and we haven't got close to solving that problem yet. But that's the kind of problem DeepMind's working on. Yes.
Thank you, Geoff. That was a very good talk.